Unputdownable, Chapter 5. As Jenkins pulled them onto the scenic thoroughfare that would take them to the Pinnacle Cliffs, he uttered a quiet word, and Pine's seat began to recline. Pines knew all the features and amenities available to him, but had personally taken advantage of exactly none. But Jenkins had assisted him in exploring the car's many small luxuries. There had been the regrettable situation not long ago when Jenkins had uttered a quiet word and lowered the car window beside him. There had been a shotgun blast and a boisterous clamor of wind upon his face, and an instantly disturbing disequilibrium in the car that jostled his sense of balance. "Now stick your hand out, sir," Jenkins had counseled. "Is there an object to grab?" Pines had asked, as he attempted to divine the purpose of thrusting one's arm out the window of a moving car. At the speed they were going, there were only 2 or 3 conceivable objects he could safely snatch midair from the street without breaking his arm off in the process. A balloon on a string, a feather, perhaps. Hopefully, Jenkins didn't expect him to take hold of a flying bird. "Is it food?" Pines finally asked. Jenkins had an obsession with donuts and sweets, and Pines supposed a donut vendor might lay along their current route and positioned in such a way that one of the round delicacies could be plucked from a plate as they passed. "Just put your arm out into the wind, sir, and feel the force and pressure," was all Jenkins would say. "Very well," Pines said, in the labored and breath-filled way he'd lately learned best conveyed annoyance. "But I'm not taking any donuts, if that's your invidious plan." He tentatively probed the open space of the window with several of the fingers of his right hand. "What category of purpose is this?" Pines asked, as he allowed the arm to fully extend into the rushing air. "It's a casual activity, Mr. Pines," Jenkins had said. "Didn't you guys have any fun where you come from? Didn't you ever do anything just to do it?" "Everything we do, and did, we do, and did do to do it," Pines said. "Well said, sir," Jenkins said. "You can pull your arm back in whenever you like." "Category," Pines persisted. "Oh, gee, I don't know. Fun? To alleviate boredom? It's something kids used to do all the time. And dogs." "Dogs?" Pines shuddered. The last thing he wanted was a dog activity added to his casual regimen. "Well," Jenkins amended, "dogs would sort of stick their heads out the window. It's just an interesting feeling, Mr. Pines. Kids would often fly their hands through the air like little airplanes." "I am neither dog nor child, and am not interested in this category of useless frolic, let's call it," Pines declared with some finality, and withdrew his arm from the wind. "Duly noted," Jenkins had said, and closed the window with a single word. Now, as his seat back continued to recline, Pines wondered if Jenkins had forgotten the instruction. Maybe the man hadn't duly noted his rejection of this category of useless frolics. Or, perhaps, it had to be considered, being lain down in the back seat of one's car represented another category altogether. At the very moment Pines recognized that his status as a seated man had become that of a man lying down, a likely insight arrived. This change of state might very well be a caveat to the imminent sexual encounter with the woman beside him. Most of such activities, he knew, took place horizontally. And yet, the woman beside him, Alison, the identification plate beneath her left eye read, had not been similarly reclined. "Any preference, sir?" Jenkins now asked. "Preference?" Pines asked. "I should probably tell you at this point that I'm not qualified," Alison confided. Not qualified for what, madam? Pines asked. Preferences, Alison said. What the devil is going on here? Pines said. But as before, with his earlier outburst during the spilled wine affair, as he'd categorized it, the question fizzled with an ineffectual flatness of tone. But you know what, sir? Jenkins mused. You are, aren't you, sir? Or are you not? He finished, deepening the layers of confusion. Jenkins followed this inane inquiry with a confidence to Alison, which didn't help at all. This is a specialty of his, miss, the butler said. Mr. Pines happens to be the foremost. The foremost, Pines said. The foremost of what? Really, it was all too increasingly mystifying. His myriad thought streams, struggle though they may to converge on likely clarities, all floated into the void and popped like tiny balloons. And yet, such fragments remained, dark, formless blobs of thought matter staggering his mind. The only conclusion reachable was becoming self-evident. Pines had lost the command position of the conversation at hand. He would make one final attempt at reasserting his dominance. If he could only understand one simple piece of the puzzle, the rest might fall into place. Preferences, Pines said again. I demand you provide a list of these preferences at once, Jenkins. Like the song, Alison said, and began to hum a tune. Pines began to collate and cross-reference the notes of the tune against the catalogue of known song lyrics. There was no match, no song about preferences that shed any light, and no piece of music that matched the notes the woman was humming. It was all nonsense. I was under the pressure, sir, that you'd take the lead on this, Jenkins said, adding a final bit of mud to the already filthy conversation. One moment, please, Pines said, and he drew his eyes perfectly closed to the inset banks of his eye mountings to commence the process of withdrawal and refreshment. Though he preferred to reset at home, alone in the throne-like chair of his master bedroom, such exigencies out in the world were not uncommon, especially when one opened oneself up to new organic experience. The maelstrom of madness that preceded any such venture, no matter how small, often proved overwhelming. With his eyes closed and his electrophysiologic system shut down, Pines began manually, at least it seemed that way to him, to terminate the cluttersome and potentially damaging storm of broken thoughts filling his mind. When he opened them next, Alison was gone, and so was Jenkins, and yet the stadia was still moving. Why are you not here? Pines said to the empty car in the confusing catharsis of his reawakening. He sat up, clutching at the seat in front of him, just in time to see the axial disk of the ocean fill the windshield. He watched the shifting seas with great interest now, as a new series of unwanted thought streams began to beckon for his attention, and his view out the window swung, and the black stones of the beach far below clicked into view as the car accelerated smoothly and most peacefully into a dive as it hurtled off the cliff. Could this be one of Jenkins' useless frolics, he wondered, or, more reasonably, some further preamble to coitus? He was as yet still stirring into being, not fully returned to cognizance. He registered the fact that the car was plunging off the cliff, but the full implications had not yet resolved. He had no fear, however. The car, he knew, would keep him safe. Pines searched the rapidly approaching beach below for signs of Jenkins and Alison. Beaches presented as a locational subcategory for sexual encounter. Perhaps there was a bed by the sea, or a table set for two, with a lit candle and an open bottle of wine displayed on white linen. Just before the car hit, the correct interpretation arrived, and Pines reached for the phone in his pocket. Jenkins had performed a deviant, aberrant act. That much was clear. There wasn't enough time to make the call before the impact, but Pines wanted to be prepared to communicate his extreme displeasure as soon as possible. He dialed the number and was largely listening to the ringing of Jenkins' phone when the car crashed enormously onto the beach. His butler finally answered his phone, but said nothing. "Jenkins," Pines said, at his near topmost volume to convey his outrage. It sounded, after a moment's quiet, as though Jenkins was running somewhere. "You have crossed me, Jenkins," Pines said gravely, as the car rolled and collapsed around him, even as he was gravitationally thrust against the ceiling and then mishandled by the claw-like crushing metals of the vehicle as it managed its own destruction to the best possible outcome. Pines could hear the thin sounds of wind and footsteps from Jenkins' phone. He lay upside down in the ruined vehicle, listening now to two sets of feet running through grass. Sticks snapped, and there was the clear, hard breathing of two figures in full exertion. "Are you and the woman Alison running west through the oaken woods?" Pines asked. The oaken woods was the large forest on the side opposite the cliff he'd gone off. A subsidiary bit of Pines' cortex had dispatched an automatic emergency alert to the Colog even before the car impacted on the beach, and he knew without question that interception officers were already airborne. In fact, he believed he could hear the pleasing musical whir of their spinning craft cruising above the forest where his disobedient servant and his former potential sexual partner now ran. He could not conceive of any pattern of behavior or modifying punishment that would allow intercourse between them now. "Jenkins," Pines said, now with his full wits about him, "I believe you are about to experience the sample of my preferences and my qualifications. How I am, yes, the foremost. You should expect to encounter a very wrathful master in the coming moments following your apprehension, and I mean without delay. I have already scheduled your punishment for 1/4 to the hour." But Pines next heard the phone thump on the soft ground, followed by a growing quiet and the retreating sounds of their footsteps fading into the forest. But a moment later, yes, the definite orchestral whir of the interception officers in pursuit. Very shortly, and without a doubt, Jenkins and the woman would be in custody. Moments after that, Pines himself would be extracted from the car by the Coast Guard team now on their way. Moments after that, precisely at 1/4 to the hour, Pines would commence doling out Jenkins' punishment. The woman Alison would be an object of his wrath, but not subject to it. The Colog would manage her in whatever way they deemed appropriate, but likely she was living her last moments, and good riddance. But Jenkins would certainly be held to account. Significant retribution was in order. Perhaps even a final punishment, Pines allowed. If his butler could not account for every last one of the recent confusions, including the abstract and occlusive conversation regarding preferences and qualifications, not to mention the situation with the car and the cliff, and the subsequent running off together like lovers into the forest, Pines would have no choice. "Shall I stop your heart now, Jenkins, or would you care to explain yourself?" Pines would begin the interrogation precisely at 1/4 to the hour. Arthur and Alison Jenkins were indeed running through the oaken woods. When his phone rang, Jenkins had simply pulled it from his pocket and dropped it to the grass. Alison had stopped, fetched it. "What are you doing?" her father asked. "What are you doing?" she'd responded. Jenkins wasn't sure. Pines calling at this particular moment wasn't part of his plan. "I mean, if he's still alive, that would be good to know, yes?" Alison said. "He can't be," Jenkins said. "That's like a 300-foot drop." "In a Stadia," Alison said with a corrective tone. Stadia 7000s were formidable and mysterious vehicles. Maybe they shouldn't have expected Pines to have survived the plummet, but neither should they be as suddenly bewildered by the possibility as her father was now. She lifted the phone to examine the screen and its lone, illuminated word. Pines. "Let's see if he's almost dead," she said in a cold-blooded way Jenkins didn't like. It had been a few years since he last saw her, but Alison had grown so much older, so much colder in the intervening time that he wondered if she'd been subject to regular modification. Deadly. That was it. Alison felt somehow deadly to him, as though something essential had been taken from her. That special, warm, strong light of the girl he knew had been extinguished. She answered the phone, and they listened to the sounds of crashing and violence, and Pine's voice calling out to Jenkins. As Pine's voice pipped from the phone, father and daughter ran further into the woods. As he'd done the moment they'd pushed the car together into a slow roll and off the cliff, Jenkins reached for his daughter's hand. She'd squeezed it then, in dutiful response, more a confirmation that they'd done something now that they couldn't turn back from, but she hadn't held on. This time she slapped it away. Deadly, the word came to him again. Which refusal hurt all the more because it was so unexpected. Jenkins had regularly imagined them escaping together in this way, father and daughter holding hands as they bolted for freedom. He supposed she might have imagined something similar. Apparently not. Though Pines continued to deliver his toneless monologue, when they both stopped for a moment to listen, it wasn't to his warnings and demands, but to the whirring, warm, musical serenade of the interceptor craft as it broke softly in the distance. Jenkins startled as he understood, running faster than before, and Alison dropped the phone when it became clear that the craft was moving directly toward them. "This is your plan?" Alison shouted. The trees, oaks they all must be, grew tighter around them as though forests narrowed naturally the deeper you went. But the ground remained soft and flat and bedded with pine needles, and the scent of the air grew strangely fragrant with pine. It smelled of Christmas trees and cinnamon sticks and other homey notes that Alison knew must be synthetic. She wondered if the scent was meant to stop them, to lull them, to turn them back around, to put them to sleep as in a wondrous fairy tale. "We can't escape them, Dad. Not like this. Not on foot," she called. Her father was a flicker in the fencing trees. The singing craft was closer now, its music lavishing around them like an orchestra starting up. There was a word for that, she knew, that dismal but somehow beautiful drone of all those instruments tuning up before the concert began. She glanced into the canopy above. There wasn't a single pine tree anywhere, just the green hands of the oak leaves cutting the light away. Pine needles everywhere, and not a single pine tree. Nor was there a single fallen leaf on the ground in this fragrant oaken forest. "Alison," her father called. "Yes," she said impatiently. But then, unable to see him after a few steps, she said it again. "Yes, where are you?" "This way," he called. She turned slightly toward his voice and bumped sideways through the contracting trees. He continued calling her name and, "This way, my dear," in alternation as she weaved and dodged through increasingly narrow passages. Could the plan be to simply run into a section of the forest that was so frighteningly dense that the canopy above would obscure them from the interception officers? That wouldn't work at all, Alison knew, but maybe her father didn't. There were men and women on the ship at this very moment, tracking their exact positions, using some form of sonic technology, probably watching them clear as day on their monitors. The music from the craft itself was certainly a form of complex sonar, and the angelic blur of sound pouring its dark honey over the forest was likely draping perfectly over the shape of her body and painting her small running frame on a dozen screens on the craft above. She stopped when she saw him. "What the hell, Dad?" she said. "It's okay," he said. "We'll be okay." He was pawing at an impenetrable wall of trees, like a blind man touching bark for the first time. She knew they'd gone beyond the edges of the perimeter, that overwhelming smell of Christmas trees and apple cider, a sure sign of their trespass. That, in itself, was illegal. Not illegal, that wasn't the term they used. Their term was incorrect, and being incorrect led to modification or adjustment. Alison herself had never been modified or adjusted. She believed, however, that her father must have been. Perhaps it was small, some mild or gentle correction, but there was definitely something missing in the man. A breadth of spirit, a long, thin piece of something almost fatherly, but she couldn't say what yet. Alison herself had not been incorrect until now, and now she was very incorrect. They both were, and she couldn't imagine the consequence. The orchestra grew louder, pulsing and striving outward toward its climax. The craft was now overhead and lowering down with a gentle bakery breeze pulsing from its spinning shell. But the bird-flickering leaves above were so thick and entwined she couldn't see the craft at all. She had watched interception captures before. The ships appeared, saucer-like and elegant, like beautiful art-house buildings floating in the sky. Then the lovely, lulling music would draw everyone under the waves, setting everyone at ease, calming, quieting, stilling. Everyone would stop what they were doing and close their eyes, and suddenly it would be over. The music would fade, and the ships disappear, and you'd hardly really notice it, hardly remember it at all. You would, but not in a way that led anywhere. You wouldn't talk about it or think about it. You would know that someone was gone, that someone who'd been incorrect had been taken off to be fixed, whatever that meant. But you minded not in the least. When her father had discreetly, but ever so dangerously contacted her by mail shortly before she'd become Richard's companion, he'd included a rough, odd metal capsule in his secret package, a tiny, hard spike or stone. The only instruction he'd given her was to keep the spike or rock or whatever it was in her hand when the time came. If the collogue ever pressed for a formal interview, she should put the stone in her mouth. If they wanted to look in her mouth, she should swallow it. She carried it with her for a week in the palm of her hand. When Richard accidentally saw it, she'd had to drop it into his coffee and turn it into a game. "Don't swallow the stone," she'd said as calmly as she could. "This will be a part of your new Zen practice." The ruse had to be kept up. She didn't know exactly what Richard's spring was, but had to assume he was being thoroughly vetted, that his every experience was being scraped for violation, for incorrectness. The only thing she didn't know for sure was whether Richard himself was included in such scrutiny. The stone itself seemed at first to do nothing. For 5 days she carried it in the pocket of her hand, a sweaty, useless pebble that seemed to draw blood to her palm to warm it. But on that 5th day the interceptor's craft had risen over the city. She and Richard had just left the restaurant on the wharf and were walking down the dock to his sailboat when they heard the forlorn symphony starting up. They'd both turned to watch the craft approach, hypnotic, desolating, a joyful sadness. Alison hadn't quite noticed before, not fully, not exactly, the full effect it had. The cars on the bypass slowed and then stopped. The people in the restaurant, in the cars and on the boats, all strolled out and gazed contentedly up at the spinning sculpture as it lowered over the docks. Then they'd all close their eyes in communal reverence, except for Alison. She had found the music still mesmerizing, and the temptation to close her eyes, to succumb, almost overwhelming. But she'd remained alert enough, conscious enough, to keep free of it, to look around, to observe and understand. A blue and beautifully soft flute-like passage appeared at the center of the music, and Alison watched as a large man, standing on a large boat, simply dissolved into the air. And then the music grew deeper, moaning cellos and wounded basses, and deflating tubas, guttering away as the craft itself vanished like the man. Everyone blinked their eyes open, refreshed and rejuvenated, and began to comment on just how well they now felt. The people on the bypass got back into their cars and drove off. Meals were continued. Boats pulled free of the dock. They all carried on as though nothing happened. The pill, or rock, or whatever it was her father had sent her, had done it, allowed her to stay awake, to watch and understand, and more than that, to remember without the hazing assignment of indifference. Richard had his unputdownable, and now she did too. The rock was the reason she'd agreed to this madness. It was the only thing she'd ever encountered that had proved any kind of defense against them. But now her father seemed lost at this strange wall of trees. There was nowhere else to go, and the music was blessing over them now, drippingly warm in its richness and fullness. There can't be a secret door, Dad, or some magical... She stopped. Her father had vanished into the bark of a tree. Alison was shot through first with terror and nearly slammed her eyes shut, thinking the ship above had just taken him. She waited for the blue, flute-like dirge to slide its friendly knife through the atmosphere and take her too, turn her to atoms, or transport her to the ship above, or whatever it was it did. But then his hand emerged from the tree, from the bark, just his wrist and hand jutting from the tree. She reached for it, took it. He held it for a moment in a gentle, loving way, then rocked it to and fro, as though to remind her how once they had so happily strolled through the park, hand in hand, father and daughter, before these visitors had come. And then he tugged her fiercely in through the wall of trees, into what felt like another world.